Well, hello everybody. This is the excellent reviewer, and you're gonna want to sit down for this because my oh my, do we have quite the video for you today. For quite a while, I've had the idea floating around to do a video on one Vincent Kennedy McMahon, as he is one of the most unique characters we have ever seen on wrestling television. He's a man who is a visionary in his time, but he's also the person who hates scarves. And allegedly, he hates sneezing because it is something that you cannot control. This is possibly the biggest undertaking that I have ever done on the channel, so without further ado, let's talk Vince McMahon. Vincent Kennedy McMahon was born on August 24th, 1945, and he grew up in Manly, North Carolina, which is, about the perfect place for Vince McMahon to have been born in. After he was born in Manly, he and his mother moved over to Havelock, North Carolina, and he grew up in a trailer park with a series of stepfathers who were usually violent and bad people. As Vince's father had gotten a divorce from his mother at a young age and left the family. There was this one stepfather in particular named Lupton that would usually target Vince all the time, and Vince grew to hate Lupton so much that years later in an interview with Playboy, he would say, and I quote, "It's unfortunate that Lupton died before I could kill him. I would have enjoyed that." Well, that is one tasty nugget, isn't it? Vince, aside from his troubles at home, he also grew up with dyslexia and had trouble in high school, and he would constantly get into fights at school. While Vince was in high school, he decided that he was going to enroll in military school. And the reason why he said he wanted to go to military school was to reinvent himself, because at military school, no one knew who he was or all the trouble that he had gotten into his past. However, he found out that it was easier said than done to reinvent himself, as he would continually to get in trouble while he was in military school. He said in an interview that he was the first cadet in the history of that school to be court-martialed. Vince was accused of planning a trouser dropping on graduation day, but Vince denies that. Really. Vince wants us to believe that he didn't plan that. Come on. I don't believe that. This is a guy that admits he loves pulling pranks on people and that his favorite thing in the world is throwing people into pools. The military, however, kept him as opposed to throwing him out of school, which had an immense impact on Vince himself. After military school, he would end up going to East Carolina University, where he would end up majoring in business administration, and he would end up graduating in 1968. Now, after graduating, he left home and would end up reuniting with his father, and to the reluctance of his father, he ended up joining the wrestling business. And at first, he himself wanted to become a pro wrestler before his father told him that he shouldn't even attempt it. I mean, it makes sense that Vince wanted to be a wrestler, as he would take any chance in his career to get into the ring, and why even at his current state at the age of 74, he is incredibly well built. Vince would work as a ring announcer, a referee, and a few other odd jobs before he slowly started to work his way behind the scenes. Vince Sr. owned the, as it was known back then, the WWF. This, of course, this was during the old territory days where there was no one mainstream promotion, but tons of smaller promotions. Each promotion would have its main talent, but it was strictly forbidden to poach any other promotion's big-name talent. Vince McMahon eventually started to learn how to run shows by himself, and as he started to run shows, Vince Sr.'s health had started to fail him, and he was slowly starting to want to get out of the wrestling business. This would give Vince the opportunity that he needed to take over the company, as he would end up buying his father's stock in the WWF, and own the company. Fun fact, just to take away from a little bit from the background of Vince McMahon, and that is the fact that he met his wife, Linda McMahon, in a church, of all places. So he used to be a religious person at one point. So I wonder what happened for Vince to eventually turn on God and fight him and Shawn Michaels years later. Now back to Vince and him owning the company. And as soon as he owned the WWF, Vince would start doing something that would piss off so many wrestling promoters at the time. And that was the fact that he was starting to buy all of the major promotions' big talent, like Ted DiBiase, Roddy Piper, and even Hulk Hogan, so they could end up working for the WWF. Doing this made Vince a hated man, and at the time, Vince was also taking up TV slots to promote nothing but the WWF. He was dealing massive damage to all the territories that it would not be able to recover, as Vince was trying to make the WWF the biggest name in pro wrestling. Vince also did another thing that was hugely disliked, and that was the fact that in the 80s, Vince basically came out and said that wrestling was fake in front of the New Jersey State Athletic Commission so that he wouldn't have to pay any sports taxes, as wrestling was not a real sport, so how can he pay taxes for it? It's funny that Vince basically came out and killed kayfabe, yet he got mad when Lana posted about her engagement to Rusev online while they were in an awful love triangle storyline. The point is that Vince single-handedly destroyed the territory system as well as killing kayfabe, which at the time was still sacred, and no one dared risk telling people that wrestling was fake, and all of this was achieved to make the WWF the top wrestling name. Vince even said in an interview that if his father had known what he was going to do, then he would have never ever sold him the company to begin with. Not so long after he bought the WWF and was killing the territory system, he established and made WrestleMania, which was a celebration of wrestling and celebrity and everything that encompassed the grandest stage of them all. After he originally wanted it called the Colossal Tussle before the name was changed to Mania, he took a huge gamble on WrestleMania by putting everything that him and the company had on one event. And he says that if it had failed, then there would be no WWE today. Shortly afterwards, he had bought all the top talent and put out all of the top promotions in the US out of business, but there was one that he had not managed to get his hands on. There was one that was eluding him, and that was Jim Crockett's World Championship Wrestling. Vince, of course, wanted that WCW show as well as the time slot, so he offered Ted Turner a huge amount of money, but Turner said no, which Vince was not happy about one bit, and thus the rivalry between the two began. So Vince bought a controlling stake in Georgia Championship Wrestling and had snuck his way into owning WCW. But the fans who were used to watching pro wrestling and not sports entertainment, as Vince was marketing WWE as, were now pissed to see Vince on their own TV show. Vince eventually sold his shares of WCW as he knew it would no longer be financially viable for him to own the company as long as the fans were not tuning in. Like I said, the fact that Vince had snuck his way into owning WCW made Ted Turner so angry that he decided he would put WCW in direct competition with the WWE and what we know as the Monday Night Wars. And this wasn't just friendly competition, as you all know. This was a bloody war where one side would more than likely be put out of business. At first, WCW destroyed WWE in the ratings war for over 83 weeks with their more realistic storylines and a little thing called Hulk Hogan joining a little tiny group known as the NWO. We see a little bit of how Vince McMahon is and how stubborn he could be, because at the start of the Monday Night Wars, Vince was still pushing the over-the-top, kid-orientated, bad characters like Fake Diesel and Fake Razor Ramon and the debuting Rocky Maivia. It wasn't until Vince finally opened his eyes and knew that if he did not adapt, then that would be the end of WWE as we know it today. Now, the wars got really ugly, as WCW would constantly spoil Monday Night Raw results, as well as taking top names like Hogan, the Macho Man, and Lex Luger. But despite all of this, Vince managed to adapt and eventually buy out WCW. And I want to end this chapter of Vince's career shortly, just because we all know the story of the Monday Night Wars. But I want to bring up one final thing that sums up Vince McMahon really well. He said in an interview that whenever he found himself getting beaten savagely by his stepfather, he would tell himself, if I live through the ordeal, the beating, then I won. And during the Monday Night Wars, as we covered, WCW did some questionably low tactics during the war, but despite all of the massive hits that the WWE and Vince McMahon took, he survived, and he won. Now, ever since the Monday Night Wars, Vince has comfortably sat on top of the wrestling world with no real competition aside from the rise of AEW, but that's the downside of Vince being on top. Without competition, there's no incentive to try new things or make new stars, because, well, who is going to stop or pose a threat to Vince? It explains why John Cena was on top for as long as he was, and why the Roman Reigns experiment was such a disaster, because he knew the fans of WWE that they really weren't going anywhere. Now, this next statement might be a little bit controversial, but I feel as though it needs to be said, and that's people, they say all the time that Vince doesn't listen to the fans and he makes the worst decisions in wrestling, which is sometimes true. Hell in a Cell 2019. But Vince has earned the right to ignore his critics, because despite all of the negative things that have been said about him, that have been said about the WWE, he finds himself being successful. He made the WWE the top name in the wrestling world. He put out his main competition, has made billions off the WWE name, launched the first ever 24/7 streaming network in the WWE network, and created the biggest wrestling event of all time in WrestleMania. That's just to name a few, by the way. I hear people say all the time that they can book WWE better than Vince McMahon has been doing these past few years, just because they wouldn't have booked Undertaker losing at WrestleMania 31. Now, we've all had these thoughts in our heads as professional wrestling fans, but Vince McMahon has been around the wrestling business for an obscene amount of time. This is the man who had the idea to make Kurt Angle a heel instead of a babyface when he first debuted. He knows what it takes to make mainstream wrestling successful, as Monday Night Raw has been on the air since 1993. And sure, some of the stuff that he does is questionable, like fighting his daughter on pay-per-view, walking down the ramp in his own weird Vince McMahon way, but to say that we, the wrestling fans who have never run a promotion, who have never been involved in the wrestling business aside from watching wrestling for so long, can run WWE better than him, who's owned the company for years and years, is a statement that is a little bit ridiculous. One day, Vince McMahon will die, because, as Lance Archer likes to say, everybody dies. But aside from making out with female talents, beating up Zach Gowen, a one-legged wrestler, and saying the N-word in front of Booker T, he will be remembered as this visionary and larger-than-life wrestling icon. He overcame poverty and a bad upbringing to make something of himself. He did not become a product of his environment, and through fight after fight, he managed to become a name that is larger than life. And as long as he's still around, he's still going to be held in high regard, whether you love him or you hate him.